We continue Chapter 6 from Part 3. Very great diversity of opinion has existed on the question of the contagiousness of the leprosy. Dean Alford and Bishop Trench deny that it is contagious. They cite the case of Naaman, 2 Kings 5, who, while he was a leper, held place at court and commanded the forces of the Syrian king, and also the case of Gehazi, 2 Kings 8, who, while he was an incurable leper, held familiar conversation with the king of Israel. The leper's exclusion, these learned authors assign to the fact that he was ceremonially unclean. Modern travelers and writers tell us that in Palestine it is still an open question whether mere contact will communicate the disease, but all the police regulations about Jerusalem and Damascus, and even among the Arabs, show that there is a dread of touching lepers. They are excluded from the camp and city, are separated from their kinspeople and acquaintances, and live in a community of wretchedness, having no companionship but that of sufferers afflicted like themselves. But it is hereditary with an awfully infallible certainty. Some stuff isn't entirely hereditary, but its tendencies, right, are perhaps something in the area of the family can bring certain ailments on. Dr. Thompson in The Land and the Book, Volume 2, page 519, this author says also that fresh cases appear from time to time in which it seems to arise spontaneously, without hereditary or any other possible connection with those previously diseased. The child of leprous parents may exhibit all the usual sweetness of infancy and be bright and beautiful, but just as certainly as it lives, it will begin to show the terrifying signs of the horrible disease, and will finally perish of a malady which medical science has discovered no skill to cure and almost none to mitigate. The symptoms and the effects of this disease are very loathsome. There comes a white swelling or scab, with the change of the color of the hair on the part from its natural hue to yellow. Then the appearance of a taint going deeper than the skin, or raw flesh appearing in the swelling. Then it spreads and attacks the cartilaginous portions of the body. The nails loosen and drop off. The gums are absorbed, and the teeth decay and fall out. The breath is a stench. The nose decays. Fingers, hands, feet may be lost, or the eyes eaten out. The human beauty has gone into corruption, and the patient feels that he is being eaten as by a fiend who consumes him slowly in a long, remorseless meal that will not end until he be destroyed. He is shut out from his fellows. As they approach, he must cry, "Unclean, unclean," that all humanity may be warned from his precincts. He must abandon wife and child. He must go to live with other lepers in disheartening view of miseries similar to his own. He must dwell in dismantled houses or in the tombs. He is, as Trench says, a dreadful parable of death. Bylaws of Moses, Leviticus 13:45, Numbers 6:9, Ezekiel 14:17, he was compelled, as if he were mourning for his own decease, to bear about him the emblems of death, the rent garments. He was to keep his head bare and his lip covered, and, as was the custom with those who were in communion with the dead, when the Crusaders brought the leprosy from the east, it was unusual to clothe the leper in a shroud and say for him the masses of the dead. Trench on Miracles, page 176. Now, yeah, if you have no reason to doubt the person's faith, don't deny them the service because of some medical condition they had, or even those who died for their crimes. Consider that punishment as counting. Right? So the difficulties in life, if you die from the difficulties of life, who knows that could pay for it? And by that I include HIV and stuff. Leave it up to God. But if people continue their wicked ways unto death, that's maybe something else. But in all ages, this indescribably horrible malady has been considered incurable. The Jews believe that it was inflicted by Jehovah directly as a punishment for some extraordinary perversity or some transcendent act of sinfulness, and that only God could heal it. When the man was cured and his flesh came back like that of the little child, he said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." 2 Kings 5:14 and 15. It was to be the test of the Messiah, the deliverer sent out from Jehovah. And of course, Yahweh is how you pronounce it. And that would have been from an ancient Egyptian similar sounding word. It has a couple variants, but it's the same thing. Yah, that should be able to cure the leprosy. Cyril of Alexandria calls it pathos uk iasiamon, the incurable disease. The report of it struck horror into the minds of people afar. The Greek poet Aeschylus has a few powerful lines in which he describes the symptoms and dwells, as Moses did, upon the fact of the spreading energy of the evil, and makes that an argument for the theory that leprosy was the special scourge of God. Aeschylus, Corf 271 to 274. I don't know what that abbreviation of that is, but Tacitus describes the Jews as a race detested by the gods. What he calls gods. Maybe the word is damun. The Damans, saying that when they were in Egypt, they had all the leprosy, and that when the king inquired of Jupiter Ammon how the kingdom could be freed from this great calamity, he was told that it could be effected only by driving the wretched race from the country. Tacitus Annals, or what's these? I don't know what all these abbreviations are. Book 5. Such is the leprosy, and such were lepers in the days of Jesus. Other sufferers, people going through hardship and suffering, there's actually a difference, but had sympathy and help. The leper was regarded as stricken of God, smitten of him, and afflicted by him. No one sat by his couch of pain, no hand touched his brow with cooling moisture, no kiss of love ever distilled itself on his lips. In quoting from Isaiah, the phrase is usually understood to be prophetic of the Christ. I'm reminded of a strange old Jewish tradition that the Messiah was to be a leper. And I don't see the evidence that Jews expected a Messiah, maybe an end times prophet or whatever, but Jesus says he wasn't that, and something, a comforter that was with him wasn't going to be there until he died. So I mean, that's what the Bible teaches. But this idea of just one Messiah, I haven't come across it in Judaism. I've come across it in the Tanakh. I haven't come across it in anything Talmudic or whatever. But a poor wretch, corroded with leprosy, had heard of the power and goodness of Jesus, whose reputation had gone down among the outcasts of the tombs. And we are talking about Jesus healing a leper here in Matthew 8, 1 through 4, Mark 1, 40 to 45, Luke 5, 12 to 14. He came near the wonder worker and kneeled and fell on his face and worshipped and said with extraordinary faith and pathos, "Thou canst make me clean if thou wilt." The historians of the New Testament tells this story with a calmness which seems itself miraculous. We ordinary historians are moved by the touching postures and acts and fancied accents of these two men. Laying all dogmas aside, here is a historic group of profound and powerful poetic interest. Standing there is a young teacher who has aroused the dull ears of plodding, stupid, ritualistic religionists of his day, and attracted the attention of the fashionable, the joyous, the foreign rulers of his people, and of the busy merchants intent on trade. A populous region begins to be full of his praises. He is stirring his people and his age by religious views, the most practical, full of common sense, adapted to human wants, yet lofty and spiritual, and uttered in a tone of paramount authority. And see, the issue wasn't that they did the rituals, is that they, they remained books in stone. It was only about the rituals. They didn't live the rituals in their lives. And, being different doesn't mean they're stupid, because if they were too stupid to whatever, and the message wouldn't go through because they didn't have the intelligence to pick it up, right? His life is blamelessly pure. The innocency of infancy, the tenderness of womanhood, the strength of manhood, the gravity of a sage, the endurance of a martyr, and the daring of a hero must have been mingled elements of his aspect and his manners. Serene and lofty and sweet, Jesus stands, while at his feet a leper lies, disgusting, loathsome, rotten. He has been burning with fever for many years, for he is full of leprosy. It is in his blood and flesh, a fret and a torment. He has no help from medicine or nursing. He can look forward only to a death in life existence, whose nights shall be filled with dreams that scare and visions that terrify, Job 7, and whose mornings shall be an awakening to face an approaching and inevitable doom. This is his only and his last chance. He has heard of the mighty deeds of Jesus. His faith in the power of Jesus is unfaltering. The Messiah will be a leper curer. This is the Messiah. He can, will he? That is the question. If the goodness of this wonderful rabbi be equal to his power, the leper will be saved. But perhaps the leprosy is the one evil God is determined not yet to remedy, and this, after all, may not be the Messiah. Now, a lot of faiths would deny the existence of natural evil, something difficult or bad in a non-moral sense. That's not evil. And evil can sometimes be seem positive and beneficial and all that in material terms. So, you know, it becomes very problematic when you start saying, oh, that person has a disease, it's evil. It's like, no, it is not improbable that all these thoughts passed through the mind of the sufferer. He saw and fancied his home, his wife, his babes, and all that makes the home circle powerful in its attractions. If the great teacher should cure him, he should go back to all those dear delights. If he refused, then the tombs and wretched companionship and despair. Will he? Let us look up from the suppliant to that face of lofty lovingness. Jesus moved with compassion. No one else had ever felt so for the leper. All others had been moved, but it had been with disgust or horror. The brow of Jesus lifts itself. The eyes of the teacher soften and brighten. His hand stirs slightly. His lips quiver with emotion. His frame is perhaps agitated. All health, unbroken wholesomeness, untainted physical purity, stands face to face with disease and corruption. It is a moment of critical conflict. He is about to speak a word which is to be decisive of his power or his feebleness. There can be no half success. It will be complete and surpass in its effects all other words that ever passed human lips, or be instantly followed by a surrender of moral power. He dares to utter that word, and does it with elevated calmness, fearless of ceremonial impurity. Or infectious disease, which, if you don't know what you're doing, is not, the way, but right. Stepping forward, he breaks through the whole ceremonial law that severed this abject sufferer from decent people, and laying his fingers on the hot head of the throbbing leper, thrilled the sufferer with the delicious sensation, and into his ears, all stuffed with matter of corruption, shot the music of the simple speech of love and power. I will be clean. That's quite the elaboration. More quickly than can be written, the man at his feet felt new fountains of health created at his heart, new blood coursing through his veins, new flesh as of a babe's pushing the rottenness from off his bones. And he arose, shook himself, sloughed off his leprosy, and stood out clean. Immediately upon the performance of this miracle, Jesus charged the healing man not to make it known until he had gone to the priest, and offered for his cleansing those things which Moses had commanded, for a testimony unto them, says Mark 1:44. So, see, it wasn't about getting his name out, but connecting him back to religion, from which he'd been ostracized, right? The Jewish law at that time was that if a person should be restored from the leprosy, he should be examined by the priest of his district. After 7 days, he underwent a second examination, performed a lustration, and then went to Jerusalem, where he offered a prescribed sacrifice and was pronounced clean. There were slight forms of leprosy, as still may be found in Palestine, which were curable. The sanitary regulations referred to these, but still, as they were forms of leprosy, the separation had to be made. Seated leprosy was considered incurable, and until the days of Jesus, No cure is ever recorded except of those who were miraculously healed in the times of the prophets. Generally, Jesus enjoyed silence upon those whom he restored. See, his enjoining silence on the healed meant that the gratitude, people were to learn to, to form a connection to hope and the power of God, not Jesus. And the reasons are apparent. The importance of his ministry, as is always the case with great men, lay in his spiritual influence rather than in the mere words and acts which conveyed it. His miracles were only accessories for the spiritual as well as the physical good of the restored. He commanded quiet, nor did he desire to have his deeds so bruited abroad as that his ministry should be obstructed by great crowds, nor such enthusiasm generated as should lead to mobs or political complications. And also, as we see in various ways, he didn't want fanatics. A fanatic is somebody who makes it about the person rather than the teaching. We find this in music, the people who just collect all this stuff without the music, the musicians and all this stuff, and rather than, okay, they like the music, or they like the actor, or they like, these were general prudential reasons. In one case, at least, Mark 5:9, we shall find that he gave an opposite direction, but in each case, in addition to the general, there was a special reason. The priest had pronounced him a leper. If the priest, unmoved by the knowledge that Jesus had cleansed him, should pronounce him healed, the testimony to them would be complete that Jesus had really performed this wonderful deed and had thus established his claims to the Messiahship. And especially if you're going to say it's one person or something, what miracle does the Bible ever say that Jesus performed that was unique to Jesus? So anybody saying, oh, look at the miracles, that means he was God. No, it doesn't. And there were plenty of faith healings that, it didn't matter what people had faith in, and there continued to be that sort of thing. But the glad and grateful man could not be restrained. He blazed the matter abroad so much that crowds came flocking to Jesus until he was compelled to withdraw himself into a solitary place, and there for some days he refreshed his soul by devotional exercises. It was needful, for trouble was brewing for the great teacher. A Messiah that removed himself from the public was not the Messiah for the Jews. He returned to his chosen home in Capernaum. His fame had grown in his absence. People flocked to the house he occupied, whether it was a residence he had hired or one that belonged to some disciple. We cannot learn. But it was known to the inhabitants of Capernaum and to the strangers therein. And this is being bounced off Matthew 9, 2 through 8, Mark 2, 4 through 12, Luke 5, 17 through 26. But it was known to the inhabitants of Capernaum and to the strangers therein. He commenced teaching. Among his hearers were certain Pharisees and doctors of the law who had come down from Jerusalem. It is not quite easy to determine the motives of these listeners. They may have been drawn by the fame of Jesus, or they may have been emissaries come to collect testimony against the young rabbi, who had made such a commotion on his visit to Jerusalem. Both classes probably were represented in this assembly, for Luke intimates that he healed some, while some were severely critical upon his mode of expression in a miracle which he performed in their midst. The miracle was on this wise. And before we get into that, the construction here is a little difficult. The obtuse in the original has no grammatical antecedent. It is rather unnatural to interpret it as meaning these Pharisees and doctors, as on its face it seems to do, for there was nothing in their cases to make them receptive of his curative power. 4 men brought upon a pallet their friend, who was a paralytic. The entrance to Oriental houses is ordinarily by the one front door. This was blocked by the excessive crowd, so that it was impracticable to press through. But the desire of these men, increased probably by the urgency of the patient, was so great that they ascended the roof, probably through the adjoining house, and, crossing the parapet, either removed the hatchway, if Jesus was sitting in the upper chamber, or removed the awning, if Jesus was sitting in the courtyard. In reading this statement of the evangelical histories, we must collect the construction of Eastern houses. Now, including that thing that we just mentioned, we can't really say that this is historical, and we can't say it's inspired of God either, because there's going to be such linguistic ellipses and problems of certainty of what the text means, in even in its literal sense. What might be impossible as European and American houses are built in our cities was not an insuperable difficulty in the East, but it was a difficulty. And when Jesus saw the earnestness of all parties, he said to the paralytic, "Son, be of good cheer. Thy sins are forgiven thee." How much depends upon a little word. This speech by Jesus was the turning point in his history. If he had said, "May thy sins be forgiven," he would simply have uttered an aspiration of piety. But undertaking to declare upon his own individual authority the forgiveness of the man's sins, in other words, forgiving him, he voluntarily took a vast step forward, ascending to a higher and more conspicuous platform of claim, and aroused against himself all the philosophic, religious, and traditionary prejudices of his people. Well, if he was given special prophetic knowledge, again, Jesus wasn't the only one with this. It was the commission of a most, if not the most grievous crime known to the Jews. It was blasphemy. Well, even if he claimed to be God, it wouldn't be blasphemy. It would be lie. But there's a difference between blasphemy and whatever. But there's no indication that Jesus claimed to be God or Son of God in the way that nobody else around was a son of God, or could have been a son of God if they were a follower of him. But it was a claim to exercise the prerogative of God. It was making himself equal with God. Yeah, no, it wasn't. Absolutely not. It was making himself God, and and there was no retreat for Jesus. He had said it. The learned visitors said, reasoning with themselves, "Who can forgive sins but God only?" Jesus read their thoughts and manifested his penetration by telling them just what was passing in their minds. And see, that was what was going on. Not that he was claiming to be a god or forgiving the sins. It's like he knew about the person and knew that they were actually repenting, and maybe got the word that, hey, their repentance is accepted. He proceeded to establish this awful claim. Any fool or crazy man may claim anything which is not susceptible of proof or disproof. Or any sane man might believe something that people can't disprove or prove. What evidence is furnished that heaven ratifies the assertion of any human being that the sins of another human being are forgiven? It's a pertinent question. The claim may be at once futile and sinful. Jesus asks them this question: which is easier to say, thy sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up thy bed and walk? To forgive sins is not less difficult than to heal disease to one who can do both, but it is less easy of proof, as the latter is open to the senses. But neither can be done without the will of God, and Jesus will not endorse blasphemy by a miracle. And therefore Jesus said to them, that you may know that I have the power to forgive sins. Listen and behold. And turning to the sick man, he said, rise, take up your bed, and go to your own house. There was no struggle, no slow stretching of himself, no painful effort to drag himself and his pallet through the crowd. Immediately he stood up before them. He gathered up that on which he had been lying, and started for his home. The crowd disparted. They made way for this new wonder. The man went home shouting. Amazement, fear, and gladness took hold of the people. The great power of God had come down among men. And see, just like this is the case of like when Jesus said, not my will but thine. I don't know for this cup, and I speak not of my own doctrine but of the one that sent me. So this is just the same thing. But true or not, people need their freedom to exclaim some such things. It is to be noticed how Jesus, in the methods of this miracle, sets forth the close connection between an unwholesome spiritual condition and the physical maladies of mankind. He treats a disease somehow as if it were a sin. Your sins are forgiven. Rise up, go home. In this case, as perhaps invariably in cases of paralysis, some sin, some excessive self-indulgence lies at the root of this bodily disablement. Jesus is a compassionate to the sufferer, but honest with the sinner. He addresses him tenderly but faithfully. He calls him son, but gives him to understand that his sympathy with suffering does not for a moment blind him to the badness of the sin from which it sprang. So indescribably sublime was the self-possession of Jesus that no crisis threw him from his balance, and yet so obvious is it that he never thinks of self-possession and mental equipoise. His greatness inheres. Shortly after the healing of the paralytic, Jesus was found at the seaside, teaching multitudes who gathered about him. Making a short excursion from Capernaum along the lake of Gennesaret, discoursing on religious subjects, he came to the road from Damascus, which, crossing the Jordan by Jacob's bridge, went along the lake coast to the neighboring cities. Matthew's call in Matthew 9, Luke 5, and Mark 2. On this road near Capernaum or some other town, it is quite probable there would be a toll house, such a station somewhere Jesus came upon, and there found Matthew, also called Levi, who was discharging the duties of a Roman portitor, or tax gatherer, commonly called publican in our version. It was the most degrading employment in which a Jew could be found. It was making himself for gain a servant of the oppressor of his people. Jesus seems to have known him. He simply said to him, "Follow me," and Matthew immediately obeyed. Here was another shock given to Jewish prejudice. It was intolerable that he should select his circle of nearest friends and disciples from men whose reputation was so ruinously bad. Now, people shouldn't necessarily have a bad reputation because they're like a tax collector or some such thing. This, Mount Lebanon from the coast. Because not all taxation is wrong, and what the Jewish priest is supposed to collect 10% and some other stuff from people, but it's wrong for the Romans to collect something, But something more was done, probably on that very day, to intensify the growing opposition. The newly called disciple made a great feast at his house. All his old companions were welcome to his table. On this day, he must have consulted Jesus, who did not object to dining with publicans and those technically called sinners by the scientifically religious Pharisees. And so there was a great crowd of bad men, and Jesus and his disciples eating with them. This seemed the crowning outrage. He had pronounced a man forgiven who had not gone through the ritual, thus bursting the bands of sacerdotal succession and ecclesiastical exclusiveness. He then broke down the pales of social life, which were also themselves of ecclesiastical construction. The Pharisees remonstrated with his disciples, but when Jesus heard it, he said to them with splendid irony, "They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. Go learn what God meant when he spake to his prophet. I will have mercy and not sacrifice." Hosea 6:6. And I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Well, that's the thing. The religious order is falling. Largely, if things are made too difficult for the people to follow it, you're going to find more liberals. And then you're going to find the liberals in the first place are going to that are, letting go of beliefs and practices of what to do and what not to do because of their own personal interest, or maybe somebody else convinced them of it. His reply was silencing to the Pharisees and should be instructive to people of all ages. It first quotes the proverb, "The physician is not for the whole, but for the sick," which was known to the Jews and other peoples. Gentiles shouldn't be used if we're not referring to people who've turned their back on God or whatever other term we see used, and is of universal use. It's found in the Talmud, Babylonian title Bara Kama, folio 46, column 2, used by Antisthenes in Lartius, in Diogenes, in Stobaeus, Pausanias, in Plutarch, Ovid, in De Ponto. It was employed, ironically, against these Pharisees. They were as unsound as the sinners that sat in meat with him, the difference being that the latter knew themselves sin-sick and the former did not. Seriously, the place for the physician is in the wards of the hospital, and not in the crowd of hearty, healthy laborers. The man whose purity and exaltation of character are not such as will draw the low to his higher platform, and not be degraded to theirs, is not the man to be even a moral reformer, not to say a great regenerator. Men cannot from great distances do good to their fellow men. It is amid the amenities of social life that much is done for good morals. And then he quoted from their sacred books, "I will have mercy and not sacrifice, says God. When afflictions come in his providence, they may have a chastening effect, but lacerations of ourselves or others, of our bodies, of our souls, are not acceptable to God, who prefers a life of love